Hi, do you like food? Me too. Food is pretty good. We kind of need it to survive. There's lots of different kinds of food, and something that makes food so good is spices. And since we can't have no white people cookout, we need to go to the store and buy our $5 vial of paprika. But there was a time where spices were only meant for the highest of royalty. Wars were fought over them. A lack of them caused the biggest discovery in world history. Let me explain. If you go to the store, go into the spice section and just gander upon the vast number of yummy flakes, cloves, what have you. If you brought a medieval peasant to your nearest Safeway, or what do you on the East Coast have? Aldi? I don't know. Sorry. If you brought a medieval peasant to your nearest supermarket and showed them the spice section, they would probably have a stroke. Why? Well, back in the day, some spices were incredibly valuable, some even more valuable than gold, and most of the time they were used as currency. Now, humans who have had access to spices have been using them for thousands of years, but they only grew in certain places. Modern technology allows us to grow spices basically wherever we want, whenever we want. 500 years ago? Not so. Now, there's a certain thing that happens when a lot of people want one thing that is in very limited quantities. Things tend to get violent. The 16th century saw the beginning of the exploitation of Asia by European nations to take advantage of the source of spices, and the subsequent conflict between those European nations. There were a few major players in it, each with their own insane history surrounding it. I had thought for a while about how I wanted to do this, and I kind of decided to split it up into 3 different parts, as it allows me to explain each nation's history in depth, but also content. So in part 1, we're going to discuss the nation that kicked all this off, Portugal. Let's get into it. Bit of a disclaimer, whenever we think of spices, we think of stuff like this, things that make food yummy, they're spicy, they're garlicky, whatever. But during the height of the spice trade, spice was sort of an umbrella term for exotic natural goods. Things like sugar, pepper, herbs, wool, iron, ivory, all that. Even animal secretions, for some reason. But foods like peppers and garlic were the most exported. So today we're just going to be talking about spices for foods. Anyways, sorry, I just really want to quickly mention my Patreon. My lifelong goal is to become a collegiate level history professor, and a teaching credential in the places I want to go to school can be about $15,000 to $20,000. Now, I've been attempting to save up for this as much as I can while I'm still in the early stages of my education. But I have a Patreon set up if you would like to help me out in that journey. If you don't feel like it, totally fine, don't sweat it. I just thought I'd let you all know about it. And thank you very much to my very first patrons, Drewski and Amber, aka Moms. Thank you guys so much. You have no idea how much that means to me. But anyways, thank you, and let's get into the video. Let's set the stage really quick. So the history of trade between Asia and Europe is very long, and I think the best place to start for this video's purposes is the founding of the Silk Road. Opened by the Chinese Han Dynasty in 130 BCE, the Silk Road opened trade between Asia and Europe for over 1,000 years. These routes were used in trading things like silk, surprisingly, spices, cotton, wool, tea, ivory, metals, and most importantly, culture and ideas. Asian countries like China would trade for things like spices with places like Indonesia and India, and then trade those spices to Europe. The Silk Road was a pretty good system for all involved. But it wouldn't last forever. With the year 1453 came the end of the Byzantine Empire when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. Constantinople had been a major trade hub, being located on the Bosphorus Strait, which connects Europe and Asia along the Black Sea, and the main Silk Road trade route went through it. Constantinople was insanely profitable for the Byzantines. When the Ottomans took over, they imposed taxes and tariffs on trade so badly that it essentially closed the Silk Road after almost 1,500 years. These monetary restrictions helped begin the age of exploration, in which European nations tried to find new trade routes along the sea instead of land. Almost right after the fall of Constantinople is where our story begins. Now, even before the fall of Constantinople, the Portuguese had been looking for a faster trade route to Asia since like 1415, and they thought that would have been sailing around the south coast of Africa. But this was a pretty daunting task, mostly because Africa is freaking giant. But luckily for them, by 1460, naval technology had improved to the point where they were able to do this. And since Portugal had been pretty geographically isolated while the rest of Europe was dealing with they had somewhat of a head start in this search for spices. Around this time, new nations in Africa came around and were open to trade, and in 1460 the Portuguese landed in Sierra Leone, or the Ivory Coast. Here they established good trade relations with those Africans, and traded for things like gold, pepper, ivory, and slaves, which a lot of them were brought back to Europe and some to the Americas later on. But it would take another 28 years for Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias, who lived a very satisfying amount of time, to become the first European to round the southern tip of Africa. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama became the first to round Africa and land on the Indian subcontinent. Would be huge if some Italian guy hadn't landed on the outside of India about like 6 years earlier. I'm kidding. In 1510, Portuguese general Alfonso de Albuquerque captured Goa with help from the Vijayanagara Empire, and it became the first territorial possession for Portugal in India. I googled it, and no, Albuquerque is not named after this guy, unfortunately. Being the first Europeans to really settle down in Asia, these settlements in India became incredibly profitable for Portugal. And after complaints from local leaders after lack of currency to drive the market, Alfonso de Albuquerque began the first Portuguese mint in India, which further solidified their claim to the territory. While Indian acquisitions were important, they were just a step towards their ultimate goal, the source. Europeans knew a few things: Jesus rules, Islam's rules, and spices came from Asia. But where they came from exactly was up to speculation. Of course, those in Asia who traded those spices to Europe knew exactly where they came from, but all those dirty Europeans knew is that it was somewhere east. And these new territorial acquisitions in India finally allowed Portugal to understand where these spices were coming from. Controlling the spices meant controlling the market, so it was a big priority. In 1509, 3 Portuguese ships left India and landed in the port of Malacca, allowing Alfonso de Albuquerque to capture the city 2 years later. It's here that I'd like to discuss the suggested book of the video, Spice by Roger Crowley. It is a completely up-to-date account of the 16th century race to the source for spices, and is the reason that I made this video. It is a great way to learn about the subject, and I'll have a link in the description if you want to get it for yourself. After securing Malacca, Albuquerque sent out embassies to Thailand, Burma, and Sumatra to announce their presence in the region and their intentions for good trade relations. At the same time, 3 ships had set sail from Malacca to try and find the island groups of Molucca and Banda for cloves and nutmeg, respectively. The man in command of these ships was Antonio de Abreu. The fleet consisted of the Sabaya, captained by Francisco Serrao, the Santa Catarina, captained by de Abreu, and a smaller ship piloted by a young man named Francisco Rodriguez. Fearing bad reception from the locals, Albuquerque had sent out a small junk ship in front of this main fleet, hoping that the Persian captain Ismail would be able to alert the natives ahead of time and perhaps ease some tension. From here, the fleet would enter the Malay archipelago, a completely unknown region to Europeans. This area was made up of thousands of islands with many different unique cultures and languages. Due to the unknown sailing conditions, the Sabaya was soon wrecked near the coast of Java and left behind. Their original intention of reaching the Moluccas Islands for cloves was interrupted as winds pushed them southeast, but luckily for them, they could continue on to a smaller group of islands, the Bandas. Being volcanic, the Banda Islands were incredibly productive in nutmeg, and their slopes were basically completely covered in nutmeg trees. What remained of the fleet landed on the biggest island in the Bandas, which was basically a European's wet dream. There was so much nutmeg, in fact, that the captain of the Portuguese fort at Malacca commissioned several large sailing ships called a nau, which was capable of carrying up to 500 tons, to be sent to Indonesia. That's how much nutmeg was there. Possibly unintentionally, the Portuguese acquiring territory in India and also taking Malacca kind of messed up the trade relations and trade routes of those people, mostly those living in the Spice Islands themselves, the Bandanese. This worked in the Portugueses' favor as those natives were now very open to trade, and trade they did. They loaded up their ships with nutmeg and mace, which actually come from the same fruit, as well as some cloves, and the explorers began making their way back to Malacca. Unfortunately, their ships were no longer suited to long-distance travel, and the ship captained by Francisco Serrao was sunk, stranding them on an island, with no food or water. Their location in the Banda Sea was a pretty common place for ships to wreck, and so it was infested with pirates. but Serra and his crew managed to pirate some pirates and steal their ship. Landing on a nearby island with their full metal armor and muskets, the Portuguese made a pretty crazy first impression. It is here where Serra would begin taking advantage of the local island politics. It just so happened that the island they landed on, Ambon, was currently in a war with another nearby island. The kingdom on Ambon was called Hitu, which employed Serra and his men to fight with them, and they had a big impact. Hearing of this, in 1514, the Sultan of the Islamified island of Ternate invited the Portuguese to help in their fight against the nearby island of Tidor. The Sultan made the surprisingly common mistake in history of trusting a foreigner with their own foreign affairs and giving them way too much power and influence. The Sultan wanted to make good relations with Serra and his men, and the Portuguese in general, as he saw it as a way of reinforcing control over nearby island kingdoms, and also because he saw now Portuguese-controlled Malacca as a vital vessel to trade their massive stocks of cloves. He made Serra his advisor and became very close with him. So why did I bring up that mistake of giving a foreigner too much power? Well, the Portuguese saw foreign relations a little bit differently than those living in the Spice Islands. In 1515, Alfonso Albuquerque wrote a letter to the King of Portugal with news saying that Serra was alive and that he was now in complete control of the Clove Islands and governed the king and all the land. Serra essentially took advantage of pretty crappy island politics and managed to take control for himself, as other Portuguese ships left with giant stocks of cloves and nutmeg and mace. Serra stayed behind. Now, reasonably, this would probably make the King of Portugal pretty pissed. He's probably the one who wants control over the Spice Islands, not Serra. So how did he even get away with this? Well, communication worked a little bit differently back then. It would take months for Portugal to communicate with, say, Moscow. And can you imagine how long it would take for Portugal to communicate with somewhere as far away as Indonesia? Nonetheless, Serra. He had found himself on the very outskirts of the Portuguese Empire, in a place that was completely unknown to any other European except for him. Interestingly, from here on, Serra kind of disappears from the historical record, just a shadow of Portuguese ambition. Serra would still occasionally write letters back to the king and his friend Francisco Magalhães, which apparently would smell of cloves and nutmeg, which must have drove those in Portugal insane. Now that we've gotten through the first European encounter with the source of the spice, I think it's important that we add some context. So in 1494, Portugal was in a big territorial dispute with their arch enemy, Spain. While they had both been discovering new worlds, Spain in the west and Portugal in the east, there needed to be some clarification on who exactly owned what. Of course, the man to make this decision was the Pope. Pope Alexander VI, born in Spain, was getting his sleeves tugged by the Spanish royals to essentially verify their discoveries in the West and make sure that places like Portugal couldn't take any of that newly discovered land. So he drew a line, about 100 leagues, or 320 miles west of the Portuguese-owned Cape Verde Islands. Spain was to own everything west of the line, and Portugal anything to the east, and nobody was to own any land already owned by a Christian nation. Portugal wasn't too happy with this, and they met with Spain in Tordesillas in northwestern Spain and agreed to move the line to 370 leagues, or about 1,100 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands. The Treaty of Tordesillas was ratified in 1506 and allowed Portugal to make land claims in western Brazil. You might be thinking, oh, Austin's going on another one of his tangents. Well, this is actually really important. Here's where this comes into play. Back in 1506, Spain knew that they had discovered some new land in the west. They had no idea how much they had actually come across, but that wasn't a problem, because they owned all of it, apparently. The problem for Portugal was they didn't exactly know where the Spice Islands sat in accordance to the Tordesillas line. They needed to know if they really owned it. And since nobody really had any clue that the Pacific Ocean was going to be like a third of the Earth's entire surface, it was entirely possible that the Spice Islands did not lie in their section of the Tordesillas Treaty. Spice was the main influence for their journeys, but this clarification was also a big part. Alright, now that we have some context, let's continue. Since Portugal was the first to encounter and begin to exploit the source of spices, they had to come up with ways of hiding their discoveries as much as possible. One way was pretty ingenious. In 1519, Portuguese King Manuel I commissioned a book of exotic maps. What was created is known as the Miller Atlas, a really nice piece of art with a few discrepancies. For one, what the hell is this giant landmass ringing the bottom of the Earth? Second, there's no Pacific Ocean. Like, I know that they didn't think it was as big as it was, but come on. And third, and most importantly, this map was created with the intention of making the Spice Islands out to be incredibly hard to navigate, if not impossible to access. All of these little islands around the actual islands are not real. The real islands are in a relatively accurate position, but all of these shoals around them don't actually exist. The lack of a Pacific Ocean was meant to convey that there was no access from the east, and the extra fake islands were meant to convince other European competitors, namely Spain, that they shouldn't even bother trying to find these Spice Islands, but also show them that they were owned by Portugal. The Portuguese did such a good job concealing the true details of their travels that a lot of European nations didn't even know how they got there. This is here when we see the Tordesillas Treaty kind of come back to bite Spain in the butt. Like I mentioned earlier, nobody quite knew the exact size of the Earth, and nobody quite knew how giant the Pacific Ocean was going to be. All they really knew was there was a sea on the west side of the Americas that was possibly near Southeast Asia, and after conquistador Vasco Núñez de Balboa discovered the Isthmus of Panama, it became an ever more tantalizing proposition that the Americas were permeable somewhere. They just didn't know where. This speculation created a boom in map creation, essentially educated guesses at how the perceived western route to the spice source may look. Here's an example from 1515 by Johannes Schoner. You can see the clear and easy access to Asia through the Americas and under South America. Also notice how little space there is between the Americas and Southeast Asia. Fun fact, this map is actually the first time anyone had labeled them as the Americas. But this is just one of many examples that present an optimistic view of this possible journey, a journey that Spain was banking on. But we'll get back to that. We need to talk about one of our characters from this video, one man who has remained relatively in the background, Fernão de Magalhães. Having participated in many decisive battles for the Portuguese in their attempts to find the source of the spice, like raids in East Africa, the capture of Goa, and the capture of Malacca, among others, Magalhães had accrued wealth beyond his wildest dreams. However, after wrecking his ship and becoming essentially destitute, Magalhães had to look to other ventures. In a similar vein to Columbus, he had a bit of a radical idea of sailing west to try and find a new route to the spice trade. But unlike Columbus, who was going in blind, Magalhães wanted to try and find a way through or around the Americas that was reliable. With speculative maps and letters from his friend Francisco Serra as evidence, he jumped through political hoops for some time, gained a crew, but was ultimately shut down by the Portuguese government, who saw his venture as a waste of time, not worth funding. They had already found the Spice Islands and a route to them. Why would they want to keep trying to find another? Discouraged and desperate, Magalhães looked elsewhere. Oddly, again, he turned to the ever-ambitious Spanish crown of Castile. Luckily for him, they agreed to fund his voyage. They agreed because, like I said earlier, they needed to find a way across these two giant landmasses, potentially blocking them from Southeast Asia, while still remaining in their own Tordesillas Treaty territory. They switched his mostly Portuguese crew with 270 men, mostly Spaniards. With his 5 ships, the Victoria, Santiago, Concepcion, San Antonio, and flagship Trinidad, Magalhães set sail from Spain on September 20th, 1519, under a new name, Ferdinand Magellan.